Away we go. Um, Indy, thank you for coming on the Commune podcast. Good to see you.
Likewise, I would like to just say, can that just be my introduction right there instead of who I am, what I do? Just play the bansuri. Is that okay?
That will certainly be a first, but I'm willing to take a chance here.
I, fi-
Um,
I figured we're going to be speaking about something so intricate and so convoluted, and we might as well start with some harmony because before we dive into the complexities,
yeah, indeed, I do appreciate that because and feel free to bring that out at any time through our conversation if things get a little too heavy and convoluted because I certainly think that the door needs to be somewhat ajar for some levity in 2021.
Yes.
um, so we're primarily here today to talk about the Indian farmers protest and I guess I'd say with all the news surrounding American politics and the impeachment trial and whatnot, this issue, which impacts literally hundreds of millions of people, has been somewhat cascaded to the periphery of the news cycle. So, very appreciative of your efforts to bring it more front and center and to garner some awareness to it. So, thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for holding space here. I have to acknowledge you for being a leader. I mean, I think a lot of people are not sure how to hold space for this, and I think you showing up in this way is saying a lot about you as well, and showing up and holding space about this conversation because we don't know what's right or wrong, but having the conversation is what leaders do. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks for saying that. I'm appreciative of that, and certainly of your your persistent efforts to bring more awareness to it. Particularly bring it more squarely onto my radar, and like we just discussed before we pressed record, I certainly am very ignorant to the nuances of this particular issue, but I've committed to learning about it. And I think once listeners make the effort to begin to learn about it, you can't uh, ignore it because, like I said, it does impact so many people. And I know that these protests have personal resonance for you because I believe your family still operates a farm in Punjab,
Yes,
um, and you undoubtedly have personal insight into the lived experience of farmers in India, and I think that that's going to be really important to get into because while there's sort of a macroeconomic discussion to be had here, um, like I said, this is impacting millions of people on the ground. But I think before we get into that, maybe we can zoom out and talk about India more broadly for a moment because like many listeners, to be honest, I wasn't aware of the scale of this issue until recently. So I'll just kind of recite a few just broad demographic cliff notes, and then maybe we can just kind of get into the blood and guts of it a bit. So, India is the second most populated country in the world. At last count, I believe there's somewhere approaching 1.4 billion people. Um, and the society remains heavily agricultural. I've seen a variety of different statistics. You know, and I've tried to balance the different statistics that I've seen. I've seen, the number 53% jumps out quite a bit, which is, you know, pointing to the idea that, 53% of the people in India um, make their living, derive their primary income from agriculture. So either they're an agricultural worker, or they're actually cultivating the land themselves. And so we're talking to the scale of 600 million, 650 million people. Um,
And
for
and Jeff,
yeah.
you have to also include that's like the people who are registered, right? Like how many there might be so many rural people who might be indigenous or might be off the radar. Of that.
Right, yeah, and just for any kind of comparison, the United States has 330 million people, more or less, in
Mhm,
total,
mhm.
and 2% of Americans derive their income from farming. So, we're talking about a completely different kind of economy and situation. Um, and then, from a governmental structure perspective, since 2014, Narendra Modi has been the prime minister. He is the leading member of a right wing party called the BJP, which has been generally um, referred to as a Hindu nationalist party. There's a lot of obviously there's a lot of history about the BJP and where it came from, and we can perhaps talk
God,
about that. But
But Jeff, before we do the right wing, left wing thing, I don't know why these days I'm starting to feel like less inclined to even like look at things that way because it seems that like it's not even a right wing thing. There is actually the philosophy is mentally ill. It's like what they're operating on isn't even a philosophy. It's like a mental illness, that they're operating on.
yeah, and I think it's fair to say that sort of notions of neoliberalism haven't been monopolized by the right or the left. They've
Mhm,
been adopted in many ways by both sides.
mhm,
But I think it's fair to say that Modi kind of came in with this idea of like, we're going to modernize the Indian economy, we're going to privatize it. Um, and as part of that effort, last September, the government passed three farm bills, which would essentially overhaul the decades long system that has been in place and provided some degree of security, nebulous security for farmers in India. And the passage of these three bills have led to mass protests,
mhm.
including kind of the erection of these massive protest camps on the highways surrounding um, New Delhi, the capital. But I guess before we get into the protests and the nature of themselves and these new laws, I wonder if you could take a little bit of time to describe the ground conditions of how the Indian farming system works now and has worked over decades.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because we as I've been learning and understanding more about this and trying to be more educated about it, I've come to the realization that the international farming and industrial system is quite connected. Actually, when India first got independence from England, which that's a whole another story in itself. We could talk about how England totally left India in a really bad state, and separating it too into Pakistan and Bangladesh, and separating Punjab, which was the most fertile part of India, and actually literally cutting a line in it was created a Holocaust in India. A lot of people don't know. Millions of people died. Some of my family lost their land overnight because of that partition, which was actually it was divide and conquer, at its finest. But what ended up happening is after that, India was very food insecure. A lot of people were poor. England had extracted a lot of resources, so like poverty was rampant in India. So they had to figure out a way to feed everybody. And that's when I think it was like the Rockefeller organization, Ford Foundation, so a few American organizations brought this green revolution, like great marketing. They brought a green revolution to India, with the intention to modernize at that time, like the 60s, 70s, to kind of like push modern farming practices, which actually ended up bringing a lot of pesticides, a lot of chemical fertilizers, and actually degraded the land in here. In fact, my family's land is kind of like half of it's messed up now because of the practices done by the farm that's next to it, right? Which was because of this green revolution. But the green revolution also did this thing where it kind of overproduced just a couple of crops, right? I think it was wheat and rice. It's like overproduced it, And so everybody kind of like started leaning that way, and it kind of took away everybody's normal practices. And my mom used to tell me that they used to grow so much more sugar cane. They used to have a lot more like diversity in the food in Punjab. And then when the Green Revolution happened, diversity went out the window. So we got to understand that that Green Revolution was actually a Western influence, right? It was a Western influence. And mind you, as I've been studying this more and more, Jeff, I'm like, wait, the farmers in America protested that too. Back in 70, I think it was 78. They had a tractor rally. Do you know about that?
I'm not aware, no, but
There was a
that,
tractor rally where thousands of tractors like took over DC. This was like in 1978, and they were trying to fight the same thing.
yeah, well, that's interesting because I'm sure that many people in India are looking at America and Europe as as a potential future models for India. And like I mentioned, 2% of Americans derive their income from farming now, but that wasn't always the case because over the last couple generations there have been massive consolidation in the kind of propping up of big ag. I think it's kind of worth saying that I think the average American farm is based on a plot of land that's 450 acres average. And then, of course, there's like these mega farms. But in India, you know, I think the average farm is like 3 or 4 acres. So it's mostly individual families farming their own land. And I think that this is at the core uh, of probably like a decent policy debate of like, is that a tenable long term plan for a country that has to feed 1.3 billion people with a leader that wants to quote unquote modernize? And there's probably plenty of good faith conversations to be had about policy, but that's kind of as normal. We've veered away from policy into some more dangerous kind of political and religious territories. But sorry to take you kind of off.
Oh, right. No, I mean, I'm glad you put that into reference because for me also, I'll keep telling the story, but what's important about this story is to understand is that as I've been also looking into like what's going on with farmers unions here. Sorry, Jeff, I have to acknowledge I'm Indian, but I'm also American. Like I'm like both, right? So I feel hypocritical like these days for the past few months, I've been feeling very hypocritical caring about what's happening in India, but at the same time, not caring about what's happening in my own backyard here in America. And as I started researching, I'm finding all this like articles and like interviews of farmers unions here in America wishing they had the solidarity that the farmers in India had. They were like, we wish we were that together here because they're getting taken advantage of. Rural communities in America are like getting obliterated, as we speak. So what the farmers in India are fighting for in India, we've already lost in America. So
Right.
that's something for us to acknowledge. Um,
Yeah. No. No. Absolutely. So I know from the sort of uh, relatively superficial research that I've been able to do that there for a long time there's been these systems of and you'll have to correct my pronunciation if I get it wrong, which are like mundis, right? Which are these kind of government run wholesale operations that
Jeff,
are
Jeff, we're gonna have to go there one day. They're so fun. There's so much energy in those places. It's so great.
so as I understand it, these are kind of markets that are local and they buy directly, well, somewhat indirectly from farmers. Now there's a level of brokers in between which reeks like the mob to me, though. I don't really know, but because but essentially, from what I understand, is that there are some minimum pricing standards that these mundis set. So, and it's not like they provide great riches for the farmers, but what they do create is at least a degree of predictability where a small farmer can project their income because they know if they produce X amount of wheat, that they'll be able to sell it to the mundi for X amount. Now, that's also sold like through a broker who's skimming probably off the top in different ways. And um, but these new farm bills or laws are really upending that system and opening up agriculture to more private interests. They're also kind of
Right.
taking the lid off the amount of um, grain, for example, that you could
Right.
stockpile. So there would be more ability for big actors to come in and influence pricing, et cetera. So maybe kind of unpack a little bit of that, of like what's how have these farms been operating, and how do these laws really threaten the way of life, so we can kind of get our heads inside the Indian farmer a bit.
I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that these farmers are not like crazy educated, right? They're not like they don't have like law degrees or have connections. Really, it puts them at risk to be run over by the free market. Like they're trying to create a free market, and we can go. That's a whole nother discussion. I'm sure you've had that talk about free market, if that's a real legit thing, right? But
Yeah.
really, what this does is kind of puts these farmers who are just like they're just like they've just been doing this for years and generations, and all of a sudden now they're at whim to the free market where they can be exploited. I mean, the Mundi system, it wasn't great itself too, I have to admit. I mean, it was supporting them kinda, but actually, I would love to reference, and if people can, they're welcome to research this. There was a thing that came out in 2004. It was actually the government, by the way, mind you, Jeff, the government actually had the idea of the Mundi system. So it's like it's their own idea, right? It's not something that the farmers did on their own. But there's a thing called the Swaminathan report, which was a commission that was paid for by the government in 2004, and that actually like detailed. I mean, it had economists, farmer, everybody was involved, all farmers, and they actually like detailed how the Mundi system could be improved, and how also they can like, create a system that is also better for the soil and better for the climate and better for the irrigation system. I mean, they did a whole amazing report that's been ignored. 2004. It's been 16 years. Nobody has like that. The government has not acknowledged it at all. Even they've been bringing it up during this protest. Complete not acknowledge. I mean, the government paid for it, right? It's like a commission. So to acknowledge that's really interesting to understand that right now, as we speak too, a part of these protests is a climate protest too, because India is going to be going through a lot of migration issues with like climate change, right? So a part of these protests also are a climate issue, because if you don't irrigate these things well, if you don't do soil regeneration, if you don't do these practices, and you keep using fertilizer, and you keep getting bigger corporations coming in and having bad practices of soil practice, I mean, it's going to affect, in the long run, it's going to affect everyone. So yeah, the Mundi system might be corrupt, and it's really tricky because there are people arguing for these laws that are like, oh, this is a great improvement. And they kind of are right in some places, but not right in some places, because the farmers don't have, the thing is, like, they don't have the bandwidth, right? Like if a couple of seasons they don't get support, they're done, right? And that's why the suicides are happening. That, like, they don't have the ability that the upper class has, to like last a few seasons.
Yeah, or the collective leverage, in bargaining, particularly once there starts to be more and more consolidation. If you're just a small farmer, you know, cultivating your individual land on 3 acres, it's hard to throw your weight around. Um, so, and I think it seems as if many these laws were passed without a lot of input from the farmers or the farmers unions themselves. Now, subsequently, since the protests, I think there've been a series of meetings between the government and farmers unions that haven't yielded great results, but at least people are sitting around the table trying to hammer out some of these issues. Unfortunately, while people have been trying to hammer out some of these issues, some really difficult situations have presented themselves. So I think so the laws were passed in September, and then fast forward, I think, to the end of November, there was a sort of a massive workers' strike. Um, and then that subsequently led to, I think, the visual that many of us have now, which are hundreds of thousands of people migrating to New Delhi and setting up these protest camps around the toll highways, uh, around the periphery of New Delhi, which has kind of choked um, traffic in and out of New Delhi. And these protests, I mean, these camps have like their own functioning infrastructure
It's
now. That's like,
you know what's crazy, Jeff? It's like at first, just to give everybody reference, that's like imagine Washington D.C. was surrounded and they wouldn't let anybody into D.C. Right, which kind of now they're doing anyways, but like they weren't letting anybody into DC, and they surrounded it, and they like, and basically what it's turned into is it's like an autonomous Burning Man for farmers, and not just farmers, but what's happening is that it's no money is being exchanged in these places, but people are being fed. The houseless people, like all the like untouchables, they're like all getting like, and they're all getting education and medical, and like it's like I mean, it doesn't get shared enough by the national media because the internet has been shut down. Like, so when we talk about some of the weird stuff going on here, like Jeff, one of the struggles I have is I like want to always believe in the best in people, right? And so I see this and I'm like, okay, fine, maybe India, that maybe the BJP has some, maybe they had some ideas. Okay, I'll give them the credit, but like the very fact that they're shutting out internet, right, and they're like blocking, they're like disrupting farmers' ability to feed themselves, like, and have peaceful protests. They're like all these different weird things are happening. It's like you don't need to do that if you're in the right? Like if you are, what you're doing is for a just cause, you don't need to do those things. You'd only want to block the internet because you don't want people to know what's actually happening there, right? Which is incredible unity, right? For the first time ever, Jeff, the farmers and the laborers are actually coming together. There's actually the phrase they've been using is Kisan Mazdoor Ekta Zindabad, right? Which is like that's the chant, right? That's been going, which actually translates to farmer laborer unity. Yeah, long live farmer labor unity, which is like incredible because it's like, okay, it's bringing the people who are very poor, right, who have been like kind of like used as slave labor and like all kinds of stuff for generations, right, as a caste system and a class system. They're finally getting a voice, and the farmers also are like, wait, we need you guys too, and we're together, we're in the same, and they're coming together, which is a very powerful movement if we think about it just on a global scale too, for us to understand, what's going on with that.
yeah, and particularly I think the geometry of the political geometry of it is interesting because obviously, as you've seen over the last 10 years globally, there has been a rise of populism on one side versus kind of the globalist forces of global elitism on the other side. And in some cases, there has been a sort of strange allegiance between authoritarian leaders and populism. We've seen that in the United States, obviously, with President Trump, and to some degree with Bolsonaro. But in India, this is an actual populist revolution, if you would call it that, that is actually true to its ideals and um, not and seems to be in stark opposition with actual globalist nationalist ideology on the other side. So I think there's something that feels very hopeful
Right.
about it. At the same time, you know, the Modi government is very, very popular and has a tremendous amount of entrenched power.
Right.
Um, so, I mean, Modi in the elections won by a legitimate landslide, honestly. So he has the support of a lot of people, and it's also, India is I believe, 80% Hindu country. Um, and obviously Modi is highly aligned with that. So if we it seems like the nature of these protests, which the government sort of more or less allowed in some form for a little while, that coexistence has really broken down since Republic Day, um, and the protests that happened on Republic Day. So, can you maybe articulate a little bit kind of what happened to
Yeah.
the degree that anybody can actually know what happened?
One of the things we have to acknowledge first of all with that is how most of the media in India is actually they're calling it Godi media, right? But I mean, I don't think Godi. We always have to be careful about like pinning anything on one person. He's got his thing and his legacy or whatever it is, but it's more the corporate interest, right? There's more, as we know, Jeff. We can have a whole discussion on oligarchical power and how it's more powerful than national power at this point, right? And so that's kind of what's been kind of driving the conversation on mainstream media networks in India. But I think it's important to kind of like I always advocate to people kind of like go down the rabbit hole of looking at people on the ground. Like go and see what's happening with social media of like people like journalists who are popping up who are not on the mainstream channels, but they're grassroots journalists, right? That are sharing what's going on the ground. And what actually, from that perspective, from people on the ground, the Howard Zinn perspective, what was found was that there were agent provocateurs that provoked violence on both sides. They provoked the police, and then they provoked the protesters, and then some of them actually went and did some weird activity at the Red Fort, which was like not advocated by the leaders of the farmers' protest. There's several different leaders that have been kind of taken the front from different religious backgrounds, and they were like, don't do any of this stuff, and then people still did it, and then those people disappeared. Like, and was like, whoa. And like, even, I was just listening to an interview this morning from like a older, grandpa who was saying, yeah, there were some weird people. We don't even know who they were. And then they left, and they threw rocks, they threw tear gas, and then they like left. So there is definitely agent provocateurs happening a lot. I'm getting agent provocateurs in my clubhouse conversations about this. I'm getting agent provocateurs like coming into like online digital conversations, and it's like they don't even show their face or anything, but they come in and say some propaganda, and like it's been really interesting, Jeff, to see how there's an organized actual aspect of this of agent provocateur.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, kind of the mainstream narrative around Republic Day, and I just bring that up because it does seem like an inflection point that changed the narrative from a kind of conversation, a legitimate conversation about policy and macroeconomics, to now a sort of power play that's very political and even religious in context. And this is where it can become sort of very, very dangerous and divisive. So, as far as I understand it, there was a protest scheduled, and all the permits had been applied
Mhm.
for legitimately and granted, and um, where farmers were going to come into New Delhi and protest peacefully, and some of whom were driving their tractors. Um,
Yeah.
and
My
there,
There were souped up tractors with like audio systems, bumping music. It was like very like you got to remember these farmers. I come from that background. We celebrate like when
yeah,
when we protest. Our protests are celebrations, right? They're not like it's not a bunch of anger, right? So keep that in mind.
yeah, well, yeah, and I also, don't want to undermine the seriousness of the issue, but I've seen a lot of the video of the camps, and obviously people are there for a very, very serious and legitimate reason, but there also does seem, like you say, to be quite a bit of celebration and
Mhm.
you know um, and and satsang and just
Yeah.
community building. So.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, But so on Republic Day, which I believe is the day that commemorates the Constitution in India, um, there was some form of miscommunication around the nature of the protest and the timing of when it was supposed to start or whatever. Obviously I don't have a lot of window into the details, but let's just say that it degraded into violence, and there were a number of people hurt. I think there was at least one person killed. There was the deploying of tear gas and other sorts of
They also, Jeff, they also shut down the internet right in the morning. Like the farmers are actually using the internet to like communicate where to go and all this stuff, and they shut it down at the beginning
Mhm.
of that. That was kind of weird.
Yeah, well, that's obviously going to result in chaos. And then, as you brought up, there was an incident at the Red Fort, um, which is a very revered monument in New Delhi that was, quote unquote, supposedly besieged, and there was a report of a red flag, I believe, being hoisted above
It
it,
was
which
actually it was actually the Sikh
the
country.
Sikh flag,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Which
And
mind
then the,
which mind you, Jeff, they have hoisted there before on other days because the Sikhs have actually saved India in the past. Like they've literally saved India. So it's like weird that they're like, why did you guys put that up there? It's like you guys have put it up yourselves before.
right. It just in this particular case, it seems to have been leveraged to give the government some degree of ability to sort of crack down,
Right.
and in the wake of this particular protest, like I said, it seems like that the dialogue has really changed, and now it has become something way more political and then also religious.
Mhm.
And because of the sensationalism of violence and the images associated with it, it has emerged more into kind of the international newscape,
Right.
and and in the New York Times and CNN and
Rihanna.
other.
Rihanna.
Well, so this is where I'm going, where is Rihanna then read an article on CNN. She saw an article on CNN. I assume she read it, and she sent what initially seemed to be, um, a pretty harmless tweet, which was like, something like, "Why are we not talking about this?" And maybe you can describe what happened in the aftermath of this tweet, because it seems ridiculous that this would make a difference, but she has 100 million followers or so, and this unleashed a wave of social media terror, perhaps never seen before.
I mean, it's interesting because there are effigies of hers being burned in India, and I think there's a FIR that the Indian government has filed a lawsuit against her. I mean, it's like it's almost comical because it's like it's once again it's kind of showing the reality of the situation that like if somebody like Rihanna can affect like it just shows the skin is very like the skin is very like exposed, right, of these cats, and also kind of says like what are they really afraid of? They're afraid of attention, afraid of awareness, right? And when I say they, I don't want to be like us because I really do believe in the interconnectedness of things. I think ultimately oligarchical powers, they want to keep their control and they don't want people to recognize that hey, there is something of unity about this or something of awareness, right? Because that also then that empowers these workers and these farmers and indigenous people to come together even more because they're like, look, Rihanna's saying this, and look, we got the backing of whoever else, right?
Yeah.
Juju Smith Schuster posted something, right? Juju of the Steelers, and so I think all of these things have they have this invariable effect of empowering those who are already showing up. And that's kind of what like corporate greed kind of fears is people coming together to take care of each other, right? Like that's actually, in my opinion, that's kind of where I feel this is what's kind of happening is we're seeing in India how people can take care of each other without the government, right? And like
Mm.
that's very powerful stuff, right? And that's not being shared enough on mainstream media, in my opinion, too, Jeff. I must admit, I've been trying to be like, why doesn't this show up on Google, right? Search. Why doesn't it show up on mainstream media outlets as much? I'm like, wait, that's because like we here are so separated in America. Like, imagine if we started taking care of each other here the way the Indians are right now. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it would be, and yeah, I think again, it kind of goes back to this. Trying to frame this in my head because it's not completely disconnected from this notion of the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and all of this stuff that's going on. There seems to be a general consensus that going back to normal after the pandemic has sort of like shaken up the snow globe, it is not really a viable solution. I mean, we were going you know, the sort of global vehicle was careening off of a cliff in
Mhm.
every single kind of facet of human organization, from, you know, climate change being perhaps the most obvious one, but certainly, you know, income inequality being another one. And, you know, here you see a protest movement that is true to its kind of roots
Yeah.
and has these elements of, you like you say, of community care.
Yeah.
um, and you know, it gets us scratching our head of like, well, what is the vision of the world that is the most sustainable? Is it one that is globalized and corporatized and mechanized, and or is it one that is more local?
Right.
And you know, things that, you know, I have certainly reflected upon sort of just in my own life over the course of quarantine and the pandemic, and I think a lot of people have, are like, I'm cooking more at home, I'm inside my family unit, I'm spending more time in my own local place with my neighbors to the degree that I could see them masked. I'm not getting on an airplane, I'm not getting in a car. um, I'm living, honestly, just a more local life. And there have been reprioritizations that I've had to think through of like, you know, what makes life worthwhile in the first place, and how do, you know, what's approaching 10 billion people coexist on a planet, you know? And, um, and you know, but then that gets, you know, conflated with, you know, ideas of the great reset of like, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, and you know, we can't eat meat anymore and we can't get on airplanes anymore, and that gets sort of associated with elitist corporate authoritarian overreach, and
Yeah.
these issues are incredibly nuanced and complicated to think through, and it seems like what's happening in and around New Delhi right now is this. It's a. It's just putting a microscope to a lot of these issues.
And you know, and that, thanks for bringing that, kind of like bringing it full circle there, you know, too, you know, being American and being Indian, I'm like trying to like also show up in my own community now even more. I've always been super hyper active with my local community and volunteering and being active, but now I'm leaning in even harder because I'm like, what's going on with our farmers? Like, what's in my own backyard? How are the farmers being treated? How are the workers being treated? How is our food system working? Like, are we actually, in our own backyards, are we regenerative, or are we, you know, extractive? Right, I'm starting to like pay attention to my own backyard. But at the same time, you know, with what's going on in India, you know, we have to also recognize something like this interesting phenomenon, right, where the people who have been subjugated for so long, right, the lower castes, right, they are finally having a voice, right, they finally have a movement that gives them a voice, which is really interesting because if you don't give them a holistic voice, maybe holistic is not the right word, if you don't give them a voice embedded in integrity, they're going to then follow a despot, right? We've seen that in social psychology throughout generations, right? That like if you don't take care of the rural people, you don't take care of the subjugated people, eventually they will follow dictators or despots. Like it happens over and over. We're seeing it in our own country in America, right? So we kind of need to lean in more, right? Rather than like being like, oh, those people are crazy, I don't believe them, they're like, they're not ready for modernization, they're not ready for like technology, they're not ready. I'm just like, wait, hold up. Like, what if those people actually have different needs than we do, and we have to acknowledge their needs? And same that, and the Indian protest right now, I think that's kind of what's been, like looking at it from an Indian perspective, I'm actually really proud right now that like not only are they coming together, but also my people, the Sikh people, the ones who are being called terrorists, are actually the ones who are protecting religious freedom. Like in these protests, they're the ones protecting the poor people to be able to have a voice, right? They're actually creating a space for people of all religions, all philosophies, all economic statuses to share, right? And like, where do we like we don't, our own military here in America doesn't even do that for us, right? So like, who in the world is protecting religious, philosophical freedom, economic freedom? Like, there aren't too many people right now doing that actively.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And maybe you could take a moment to actually bring this back into an element of lived experience. because I think it's one thing for us to kind of explore the macroeconomic and kind of global philosophical components of this sort of thing, but then there's the whole on another level of like really what it is like, on the ground to be uh, a farmer in India, and particularly set against the context of the pandemic,
Mhm.
which has forced a lot of people back out of cities and into rural communities. There's already sort of kind of economic contraction and an inability to find jobs. So, there does seem to be sort of an inverse demographic movement there that has made this problem even more acute. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about like what's it like to be on the ground and what's happening and what kind of trauma and other things that people are having to go through.
Yeah, I mean, you know, once again, we kind of have to like understand the lived experience coming up. Like, I have to acknowledge my mom and my father, right? Like, what they had to go through growing up, having to experience partition in India, right? Having to, like, my dad's entire family completely got their land robbed from them and taken from them and given to Pakistani authorities, right? Who didn't end up doing anything with that land, right? And so, there's that lived experience that happened, and then like my mom's family has had that in generations, but for generations. But at the same time, like up until up until like the 70s, like 60s, 70s, they were like they're fine, they were making their ways. But then the Green Revolution happened in India, which started to once again kind of like create that environment where people were once again being taken advantage of to produce, right, rather than to like live. It was like, okay, are you producing? And I had some cousins and uncles that committed suicide, right, because of that. So because of the pressure, because they couldn't even they couldn't even pay for their kids' weddings, or they couldn't pay for their. I mean, it was like it's a humbling thing, right? Like when you can't take care of yourself because of the requirements that the system is asking of you. So, but that being said, I definitely think what's interesting also to acknowledge is there has been a consistent, I don't know what is like an ignorance or attack of minorities, right? So we have to acknowledge that even though Punjab is like the California of India, right? Like it's produces most of the agriculture of India, right? And Haryana recently got separated decades ago. It got separated, but Haryana used to also be a part of Punjab. But Haryana is also a big agricultural state. So what's interesting about this is when the first partition happened and like Pakistan was separated and that whole thing happened, actually what happened was Nehru, there was a promise that was given to the Sikh people, because the Sikh culture is all based around farming, right? It's like a very sovereign kind of philosophy based on actually when it existed for 150 years as its own kingdom, protecting India from invaders. It was actually an aristocratic republic. It was actually a French philosopher came there, and he was like, "Wow, this is an aristocratic republic. This is in the 1700s, right?" So something to think about, that like the Sikh community has already had really amazing systems of management and also like appreciating each other without giving while also giving each other sovereignty. What happened was when the partition happened, it was promised that they would have their own space, but then that promise was reneged. And ever since that time, there has been this it's really weird. Like the Hindu kind of tattva, right, of India has kind of like absorbed Sikhism, but Sikhism is not Hindu. It's not Muslim, it's not Hindu, it's not any of those things. It's a very totally different philosophy. And Kundalini comes from it, right? We know the whole Kundalini tradition comes from it. But it's not Hindu or Muslim. It's actually totally different. But the Hindus kind of absorbed it. They're like, oh, you're like us all these years. And then whenever there was like any Sikh kind of like philosophy, like, hey, we need to have our sovereignty, like you guys promised it to us, it's like you guys are terrorists. And it's like, whoa, like hold up, like we just want to have our own, like we want to have sovereignty. And these bills, these farm laws, it actually activated. So we're talking about lived experience. In '84, there was a genocide at our temple, the Golden Temple. The Indian government went in. It was we can't get into the politics. There's a lot of interesting politics there. But what needs to be understood over and over again is this idea that Sikhs, anytime Sikhs want sovereignty, it's like they're terrorists. But the Sikhs actually protected India. I mean, the Sikhs actually saved yoga. Like, I mean, you guys, we gotta look at the history, you guys. Like, if there wasn't Sikhism, If the Sikh kingdom didn't exist, there would be no yoga today at all, right? Which is crazy to think about, right? The Vedas were being obliterated by the Moguls, right? They would burn books and burn temples, right? So we got to think about the Sikhs actually protected the wisdom of India. And now today, the Sikhs are also powering this farmers movement because most of them are farmers. And so they actually were first powering, and that's what actually kind of gave courage to a lot of the other farmers all across India, because they're like, okay, the Sikhs are doing this. All right. And now, as we speak, it's kind of cool. I was just watching a video today that they're actually protecting certain routes, and even Muslims who are praying and Buddhists who are praying, the Sikhs are actually watching over them to make sure no police or nobody obstructs them from praying in these protests. So it's like really interesting to see, like as a Sikh myself, I'm both like feeling scared and nervous of my people getting a genocide, because at any moment the way India is acting, it is kind of like genocidal tendencies, right? Blocking the internet, like calling a whole community a terrorist, right? That's like a very dangerous thing to do. But at the same time, I'm like, holy shit, this is like why we were made. We were made for things like this. We were made when like this much injustice, this much inequality, this much just nonsensical, like greed is happening. That's why we were invented. Like our whole ethos is to stand up to injustice, to stand up to inequality, to stand up to gender and like all kinds, you name it. Like that's why we were created. So I'm like, I both like, whoa, I'm worried, but also like, all right, let's go. This is why we're here.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I mean, the Sikhs, I think, only comprise a pretty small percentage of the overall Indian population, right? I mean, like something like 2%, but they seem to be highly identified with this movement, even though population-wise,
Yeah.
it's not even possible for them to be. But why do you think that is? I mean, I think you unpacked it a little bit there, which is a tradition of community and leadership. But why are Sikhs so highly identified with these protest movements? And maybe it's because it's easier to, like, as you say, kind of point at a bad guy. To but because I assume the protests, just by the sheer numbers of them, it has to be across all demographics of India, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sound so. I'm gonna try to like be as humble with this as possible. But the last people you want to mess with are Sikhs, right? Like they're the last. Like, and I think I was listening to this Indian economist talking about this, who was like pro Modi, right? But I like to listen to all sides, right? And he actually said that was a bad political move, that they went after the Punjabi Sikh farmers, because that was the last people they should have went after, because in our history, whenever we've been provoked, we've stood up and we've sacrificed our lives, right, for the lives of others. In fact, some of the largest organizations around the world, like showing up, to support is Khalsa Aid, right? Which is funny. Khalsa Aid is actually nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize this year, right? At the same time, India has been calling it a terrorist group, the mainstream media of India, during this whole protest. So, but it's interesting to think that like our ethos really kind of is, even though we're so small, it also galvanizes other communities, because we have showed up for other communities. So the other communities know, like, hey, this is a community that like has made sure that we don't get attacked. Like this is like, we're going back 300-400 years. The Sikh community has actually come in and literally like removed oppressors, right, and tyrants. And if not removed them, some of the gurus, if you don't know the history of Sikhism, some of the gurus did it through diplomacy. Like they didn't do it through a sword. They actually, like Guru Nanak was very famous for going around and actually like bringing despots down to the level of their constituents and being like, hey, this is how you get the people to really love you, and this is how you get real power. But he did it through music and harmony and community and service, right? So it's not just through violence, right? But it's also through community that we can and harmony that we can do this thing. I think that's kind of why people are also more like kind of gravitating towards the Sikh kind of like aspect of it. The Sikhs are kind of like also like this, they got the beards and the turbans, and they signify such like power and grace. And I have on my name I have Singh, right? And Singh actually means lion, right? And like showing up like a lion, like being with courage. And so there is this element that people feel like, at least even when I travel in India, Jeff, it's crazy, or travel around the world, when people find out I'm sick, like especially Indians, they're like, oh my god, like they get so like they're so like I can't even understand. Like they're so grateful and like also like excited that like a Sikh is in the house. You know?
Yeah, maybe you could help me understand why so many Sikhs have the last name Singh. Is it something that's adopted out of a sense of unity, or what is the that phenomenon?
Yeah, you actually got it right. Actually, the woman and the men have Singh and the women have Gore, and we're supposed to like not have our last names because our, you know, it's once again it becomes an ego thing, right? So it's like, oh, you know, then it becomes like a land ownership and passing your land ownership. So by having Singh, it's like, hey, we're one collective, right? And like it doesn't matter what my last name is. We're together and we're gonna take care of each other. We're gonna serve each other and serve and show up in the world in that way. And Kaur, Kaur, that actually denotes being a graceful princess. So not just a princess, but a graceful, like a graceful diplomatic princess. So
Good to know. I wish we could. My wife could adopt that, but I don't think that would be some form of appropriation. I have a feeling. Um, so, like, where do we go from here? Because the images that I've started to see, and granted, I'm looking, at a lot of mainstream outlets in order to get the content that I need. But I'm starting to see, the big barricades and barbed wire and images that look pretty scary, and you know um, stimulate other images of history that hasn't ended well. So and there seems to be, like crackdowns again with the internet, so it's creating chaos because people can't communicate with each other. Um, so what are your worries here, kind of in the next few weeks and months? And then, to be honest, like, is there anything that people can do, um, to help and to bring, more awareness, I guess, to what's happening there?
yeah, I mean, thanks for asking that, Jeff. You know, yeah, worries. So I've been watching my mom for the past couple months, like lose weight, you know, and she went through. She was, she was in her 30s, 40s when the '84 genocide happened. So she's still very worried. The government, the Indian government, went in with tanks into our temple, like on the temple, and like slaughtered women, children, grandparents. This is just in '84, and that was blacked out by the international media, right? And so I think that's definitely a fear. Is when you vilify any community enough, you can do whatever you want. And the way that you said they're building these things, it looked like you have to understand what they're doing. So all the farmers and all the laborers are joining. More and more people are trying to join. So what the government has done is they've literally created this two concentric, like they created a wall not letting them come into Delhi, and then they created a wall on the outside of the protest so no more people can't join the protest from the outside. So
So people are trapped.
yes, and they're trying to also like limit their ability to get water, food, right? Like because farmers have food, so they're like, so like when you say even like what can we donate, people have been asking me, oh, we want to donate like thousands of dollars, and I'm like, well, they don't need it. Like as I've been talking to people on the ground, like the farmers are taking care of each other, right, all across India. So, but the problem now is that they're not even letting it get through, right? They're blocking it, so they're blocking water, toilets. I mean, they're now the farmers starting to build their own toilet. I mean, this crazy stuff is going on in that sense. So basically, they're building ghettos, right, for these farmers and protesters, and so that's a big human rights violation, in my opinion. I mean, that's not democratic at all. And I mean, so that being said, obviously, I can't articulate. We know. I remember, I forgot who wrote that poem back in Germany when he said first they came for the socialists, then they came for. Remember? Do you remember that poem? Like, this makes me think about that, right? It's like, wow, like, I don't think anybody is safe when that stuff is happening. But anyways, so that's my worry with that, okay? how we can support. See, money is not the important thing right now, right? Like it's not going to help right now. It's, in my opinion, obviously everybody has different opinions. I've been donating. My family's been involved with an organization that for years has been supporting farmers, families of farmers who commit suicide. That's like a nice long term help, but still, it's okay, right? Like we want to do something impactful now. I think what Rihanna did was kind of showed, right? Like that awareness is big, right? And not just awareness, but like Jeff, what you're doing right now, like conversations, like discussing stuff, like explaining that these are civil rights, these are human rights that are being taken away from people, right? Forget about the farm laws, forget about the politics, forget like we gotta like sometimes when we talk about the politics, I've been getting trolls coming after me online. I'm like, I don't care about that. I care like about people's right to like do basic things, right? Be able to speak their voice, be able to come together in unity and community. So we do need to like, yeah, there's like there's people who are writing to like their legislation here, like the congressman trying to get them to talk. But once again, I gotta say, it's having the conversations, getting Jeff, getting influencers, right? Like what Rihanna did, she's an influencer, right? Look how scared India got. Like they showed us already what they're scared of, right? So all we have to do is lean in more. Like how can we get more influencers? If not taking a stand, at least having the conversation and raising more awareness. Hey, by the way, Jeff, I don't even mind if we brought in a pro Modi person and had a conversation. I don't mind, but because the thing is, the truth will always reveal itself. Those who are scared of that, they won't show themselves, right? But like we do need to have conversations that show where the shadows are. And to be honest with you, like I've been struggling also, Jeff, with like why hasn't the spiritual community stepped up, right? Like I've been a part of the spiritual community for years, yoga community, spiritual community, Kundalini community. So many people are not actually. I mean, the Sikh community is at the precipice of a genocide. The Sikh community. We wouldn't have Kundalini if it wasn't for the Sikh community. We wouldn't have yoga if it wasn't for the Sikh community. And we're actually we're calling on people to step up right now and to give us a louder voice. And not just us, but human rights, a louder voice. Food sovereignty, food justice, ecological justice, social justice. I mean, this is gender equality. I mean, there's been three activists who have been arrested in India. One of them is a climate activist. Okay, she just got recently arrested by the India. She's 21. Why is a 21-year-old girl? Why are they so scared of a 21-year-old girl? Right. Another one is a Dalit lawyer. She's been like, and she's like, Dalits are like the untouchables, right? So she's been arrested, and she's been like totally like no deep core, right? And the other one is Disha Ravi. We have to start to acknowledge that these things, that's, you guys, how are we not paying attention to as a global community? Like that, like these girls are getting abducted and molested and like by the government, like because they're still in custody, and it's like crazy that why isn't Biden stepping in? Like this, Kamala Harris is half Indian. Like this is an easy thing. It's not a hard thing to do. It's not political at this point, right? So I mean, my ask is like, let's have more conversations. Let's get more of the spiritual community to have conversations, because this is a spiritual problem. At the end of the day, this is our shadow, right? When it comes to like food sovereignty, that's our earth, that's our land. That's like the farmers in India are fighting for what we already lost here in America. So we also got to make that connection, Jeff, that like we also have to like help our farmers here in America come together and be able to take care of each other and take care of the land, because if our land is not fertile, it doesn't matter where you get. I mean, Jeff, you're in Hawaii, but not all of us are going to be able to get to Hawaii, right? So what are people going to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, all these points that you bring up are salient, and I will say that the listenership of this particular program is wellness and spiritual teachers and leaders and practitioners, and so I hope just that this information that you're providing can tap into this diaspora, so we can raise more awareness about what's happening in India, but as you say, how that translates into our own lives, wherever we might live, because while this issue is being accentuated in India, this is representative of conversations and situations that are happening all over the world. And like you say, if we're not going to pay attention to what's happening in rural America, for example, with a little bit of different geometry because we don't have as big of an agrarian community, but certainly with, manufacturing, et cetera, there is a risk if we don't pay attention to it, then there is a risk that populace then becomes, radicalized, and we go down some very, very dangerous authoritarian paths as we've seen. So, while this issue seems on some level to be local to India, it is a reflection of something that's happening, globally. And, I'm very grateful personally that you brought the struggle of the Indian farmer protest to the front and center of my radar. And, by extension, hopefully it's now on the radar of the 40 or 50,000 people that listen to each one of these episodes. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And I'll add, think globally, act locally, right? And you and I have shared before how important local stuff is, but we got to we got to think globally too, that we are a global community now, right? So it's a beautiful opportunity. Also, it's a beautiful opportunity. Hey, guess what? All the billionaires said, when there's a crisis, take advantage of it. That's not just a billionaire situation. We all can take advantage of a crisis, okay? Like, it's not just the billionaires. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to maybe come together with a cause that's not political. It's not Republican or Democrat. Like, is that, Jeff, is like farming and land regeneration and land justice, is that a Republican or Democratic thing? Left or right?
Not at all. In fact, I think one of the biggest optimistic glimmers of hope right now is in regenerative farming, because there is increasing evidence that not only does it obviously sequester carbon, but it actually produces more profitable farms and higher yields over a period of time that is not as long as people think it is. And the changing of the food system has everything to do with our personal health and chronic disease, which by extension has to do with the pharmaceutical industry and all these kinds of different things. So how we grow our food is absolutely central to the health of the planet and the health of human beings. So, this issue hits home in every way. So again, man, thank you. And to be continued, because what's happening is very, very fluid. And so I hope we can, revisit this conversation again.
Should I send us out with some flute?
Please bookend us properly.
Yeah.
Beautiful, man. Thank you.
You, man. Satnam, Waheguru. There's a saying that we have in Sikhism that's been kind of the galvanizing word, which is Chardi Kala. And they've been using this as the protest. Chardi Kala means let's go with positive optimism. Let's do everything with positive optimism. So Chardi Kala.
Chardi Kala. Maybe this is the title for the episode. I hope. Thank you. I'm Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune, where every week we explore the ideas, values, and practices that bring us together and help us live healthy and purpose-filled lives. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us.